All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're really happy tonight to be here with Judith Warner and Peggy Orenstein. Really quick before we start, just to go over a few housekeeping notes with you guys. Tonight we have a chat going on and a Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question about the book, we really encourage you to do it. There's a Q&A little node widget thing at the bottom of your screen. So if you click there, you can ask your question and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. And the second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is in the chat, I've posted a link to tonight's book, and then they stopped talking to me. It links to the Politics and Prose website. We really encourage everyone to buy a book tonight. It's a great way to support our author and to also support Politics and Prose. And without out of the way, I'd like to welcome Judith Warner and Peggy Orenstein. Judith is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Perfect Madness, Motherhood in the Age of Anxiety, and Hillary Clinton, The Inside Story, as well as the award-winning We've Got Issues. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and also a frequent contributor to the New York Times. Tonight she'll be discussing her new book, And Then They Stopped Talking to Me, Making Sense of Middle School, which unpacks one of life's most formative periods and shows how we can help our children not only survive it, but thrive. Tonight, Judith will be joined by Peggy Orenstein. She's a New York Times bestselling author, most recently of Boys and Sex, and she is also a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and Afar. So without any further ado, here is Judith and Peggy.
Thank you.
Hi. How you doing, Judith?
I'm good. I'm enjoying the storm. I love the sound of a storm. How about you?
Oh, no. See, we don't have, we're across the country from each other, which is sort of fun.
Yeah.
So I'm in California where we do not have rain.
Oh, okay.
But I remember it from my days in the Midwest, and it seems like a lovely thing.
I was actually thinking this is another one of those, rare, unexpected gifts that have come with this moment, that with a Zoom event, the weather doesn't matter. This is the
That's
kind of
true too.
away and it doesn't matter.
And it's super fun to be able to talk to you from across the country, because for the, let's see, 63 of you who are silently watching, 64 now, of us talk, may or may not know, Judith and I have known each other for some years now, right?
Yeah.
And through many books, and we don't get to see each other very much because we do live across the country from each other. So, plus I'm a big fan, and I guess we should just launch in, if that's all right with you. So, the first thing that comes to mind when somebody says they're writing about middle school is brave. And the second thing that comes to mind is why? Why would you? So, why, Judy?
Okay, I'll dive into that. I just want to say first, very quickly, a big thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us for this. I know it's a big deal to be able to have taken this event online, and I'm so glad that we were able to do it. And a big thank you to you, Peggy, for hanging in with the date change and being essentially on vacation, and also to all of you who are tuning in. I don't know if tuning in is the right word, but there are more by the moment, and that's just really fun to watch. I'm going to try not to watch, but thank you everybody who's with us tonight. And the why is, I think, the same why that has motivated each of my last 3 books that I'm never aware of at the time. But it's always kind of the same feeling or quandary that sets it off, which is that there's some situation that everybody kind of accepts as is, like this is the way the world is. And I think, but this sucks. I mean, why? Why does it have to be this way? Was it always this way? Is it this way everywhere? Does it have to be? And why do we think that this is it? And that, I think, was a big part of at least the intellectual part of what led up to this book. And then the emotional part was really that being a middle school parent, I found, was incredibly difficult, uniquely difficult. And not because of my daughters, but because of the general environment. And because of what seeing them go through that phase of life brought up for me. And I was very curious about this. I could tell that there was something going on with me as they were going through those years. but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And it wasn't the kind of thing that you could just talk about with everybody. You know, there was a very different atmosphere than there had been in the earlier years in school when people sort of easily offered up their feelings from one moment to the other about the kids or parent or whatever. Um, that wasn't the kind of moment we were in. And from the little that I saw that was, say, in the school counselor's office or just kind of, around having to do with that, the age, nothing really addressed the way I was thinking about it. And I felt kind of alone with the sense of it being so weird. That's really that feeling also just prompted the desire to figure out, really at first, the thought was, who are the 12-year-olds who are walking around inside all of us? That was the initial thought that set off the whole thing.
Well, tell me about your 12-year-old. What was your middle school experience like?
For myself, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Being very, very self-conscious, very self-critical. I mean, that's putting it so mildly. Being obsessed with my weight and my appearance, on the one hand. On the other hand, and just sort of hating people, increasingly hating everyone around me in school. That, again, on the one hand. On the other hand, I had a best friend who was 2 years older than me, who by the time I hit 7th grade was out of our school and in high school. And I adored her. And I adored my time with her and the stuff we did together. We lived in Manhattan, so we could just wander everywhere and do things. And I loved that freedom. I loved discovering the world. I loved going to museums and discovering things with her like that. And I was interested in a lot of the same things I'm interested in now. I discovered this late because all through life, I only remembered the really negative things. And then a couple of years ago, and really kind of at the start of working on this book, my mother did a big clean out of her apartment and found files of old stuff. And there were these 30 handwritten pages in sort of perfect handwriting, the person I used to be and I'm not anymore. That seemed to be some kind of answer to a questionnaire. I don't know what it was, but it was like a time capsule all about me, written by a very compulsive person. And where every question was answered in exacting detail. And all the good stuff was there that I didn't remember. I mean, some of the bad stuff, and I talked about my classmates and all the things we associate with the time, conformity and fakeness and whatever else. But I also talked a lot about the books I was reading and about wanting to be able to speak French fluently and move to France, and just sort of my vision for what I wanted my life to be like as a writer. And it was so similar. And of course, the writing style was really similar too, which was a little bit disheartening. But that was 8th grade though, not at 12.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I wonder sometimes why it seems like such a crucible, middle school. Well, actually, like, can we just? Why do we do middle school now and not junior high? What is that about? Like, I went to junior high.
Right. It was supposed to be more developmentally appropriate. It was supposed to be a way to focus in on kids in a vulnerable point of life by having them be separated with younger kids, right? So instead of being 7 to 9, which is what it usually was for junior high schools, it became 6 to 8, or sometimes 5th through 8, but more commonly 6th through 8. And I think part of that, of course, reflected the fact that the age of puberty had fallen a bit from the beginning of the 20th century, but also reflecting the fact that it made more sense to kind of keep these kids young for a while than throw them in, and make them sort of quasi high schoolers. The idea was supposed to be that the schools were going to be kind of more personable and more homey and less of a shock after elementary school, but that didn't happen. I mean, there were all kinds of big dreams that didn't happen.
Well, it does seem like, you take kids at this vulnerable time when they're changing so much, and when you would think that they need to be more seen and more understood and more supported, and you throw them into these giant middle schools. It seems exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, everything about what happens to kids in that phase of life is going in the wrong direction, is kind of happening. All the structures and all the ways in which they're interacting, especially with adults, it's all sort of designed to be as bad a fit as possible, and yet by people who understand the age group and want to be doing just the opposite. And that's been the case from the time that junior high schools first came into being. You know, it's a point where developmentally kids are separating from their parents, from their families, and trying to figure out who they are. So they're looking for their place in the world and looking for their new tribe, as the psychologist Lisa D'Amour puts it. And the opinion of their peers matters so much. They're feeling kind of lost, and they're put into these huge new environments with adults who don't know them, and so are not able to kind of be a positive presence, at least early on, for them and guide them, with way more academic demands, way more executive functioning demands. And the large size really helps feed very often the clickiness, because kids are so desperate to sort of find their people and define themselves and affiliate.
Hmm. So I guess that leads me to think about, so what are the myths about middle school then?
I think the myths about middle school really center on middle schoolers, who middle schoolers are. I
Mhm.
think that people, when you look at how people talk about middle school, their middle school memories, looking back as adults, sort of what the institution was like, it seems to be pretty accurate. I mean, there's social science research backing up the fact that middle school in the United States is just a bad passage, in the
Mhm.
educational system, and that the kids are more unhappy than they are in other countries. But I think where the
Mm.
myths come in is that adults have always had a really hard time with this age group, starting at the point when they actually had to spend a lot of time with them consistently, and where there started to be pressure on them, especially mothers, to really kind of control and shape their destinies. And there started to be choices around their destinies. So the sort of control and shaping that mothers could do, came to be a lot more important, and much more pressure on them. So this was really, more recent than we would think. It was really the late 19th century, when kids started staying in school longer, and when the belief spread that it was really important to keep them home and protected longer. So you had already this kind of perfect storm of misery brewing, um, especially with mothers being told that they have this kind of sacred calling to guide them and put them on the moral path, but also for boys, a professional path. And that adult discomfort, which was not necessarily openly talked about at the very beginning, as there were more and more popular women's magazines and popular psychology, popular voices addressing the issue of adolescence in the early 20th century,
Mhm.
you start to hear criticisms and worries that in many ways are just like the ones that we hear today. Big fears about technology, big fears
Mm.
about, the influence of
Wait, what technology?
movies and radio,
Uh,
motion
mm,
pictures and radio.
mhm,
These were the corrupting technologies or forms of media, let's say, before. I
mhm,
mean, comic books later on. There was
mm,
always some corrupting influence that parents were afraid of that came into their kids' lives right around that junior high phase.
mhm,
So depending on the era, depending on the type of community, the exactly what the threat would be might be slightly differently defined. But, one common denominator is that it turned around sex. Whether it was like fear of quote unquote smutty content, in the
mhm,
1930s, because adults feared just that advertising was becoming too
mhm.
sexualized, believe it or not. Or if it was stuff that we know about and fear and you've written about, in more recent years, where there's been real
Mhm,
hysteria about what middle schoolers are doing sexually, or now
mhm,
what they're doing online.
mhm. Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about it historically because to have those fears back then, I thought that some of those fears had to do with this new connection of of the lowering of puberty so that you have a more adult body at an earlier age. But at the beginning of the 20th century or the late 19th century, that wouldn't have been true. So, particularly for girls, they weren't going through puberty till they were 16, 17, 18 years old, but there was still that sexualized fear.
Well, the age of puberty was starting to drop in the late 19th
Uh,
century, and it was actually pretty dramatic at that point
oh,
because
okay.
middle class girls, especially, they weren't doing physical labor, food,
Hmm.
more and better food, and they were
Uh,
being more protected at home. So they were moving around less once they hit puberty age. and
Mhm.
they were going through puberty earlier.
Oh, ah,
People were living in cities, so there was this sense that they were, potentially coming in contact with the corrupting influence of the working classes,
mm,
so all of these, again, it's always the same fears that just get repackaged, decade by decade from that point.
uh-huh. That's so interesting. I always found myself wondering, back in when we were a more agrarian culture, and kids, because they were sort of the labor of the family, they lived at home. If they didn't have those fears, or they didn't have the same kinds of tensions at puberty with parents and children, or among kids, if things were very different, if attitudes and
Well, they,
such were.
just life was remarkably different and sort of where and how life was lived. A lot of kids starting at the age of 11 or 12 were actually going, to live in other people's families, to work as servants or to work in the field.
Mm,
So they were sort of off, and certainly by their teens, they were off working very, very often. And also puberty at that point was indeed coming later. So there was a shorter period between when puberty happened and when, your adult reproductive life was supposed to happen.
mhm,
There wasn't this long gap of coexistence that
mhm.
started to be in the mid to late 20th century, and that is longer now than ever before.
Right, right. Especially these past few months. It's been years. So, these are some of the things that were surprising to me. What was most surprising to you in the research?
What was most surprising to me, people always ask me this, and it's so insanely nerdy, but it has to be the truth. So I have to own it. It's my truth. Was how much was actually known at the turn of the 20th century? How much was
Mm,
known, and then how much was perennially being forgotten or unknown? Over the course of the decades afterwards. I mean, when you read G. Stanley Hall, who was the
mhm,
psychologist who basically put the modern notion of adolescence on the map. He
right.
wrote this huge book called Adolescence, that was
Mhm,
published in 1907, and that he had done just reams and reams, insane amounts of research for. And he had read the work or spoken to experts all over the world, or the West at least, because he spoke a lot of different languages. And they knew at that point that kids' brains were done physically growing, getting bigger, by the time they hit puberty. Observers had noticed for centuries that something different happened in people's minds, well, boys, because they only cared about boys, around the age of 12, sort of 12 to 15. And he, in doing his own studies and also in studying the work of others, already hypothesized that it had to do with changes in brain connectivity and in the years
mm,
around puberty. And that all of that started, right around 12 or right before puberty, whenever that happened to be, and that there was even that there was a change in myelination in the brain, and in connectivity, speed, and efficiency. And he knew and saw what he could without the benefit of all the technology that is at the turn of the 21st century proved that this was true and gave us a whole lot more
mm,
detail and understanding about what's going on with kids, especially right around puberty. So that was really striking to me. And the other thing, one other thing was, as I said before, that adults have complained about these kids in exactly the same way for well over a century. And also that when the first junior high schools came into being, the reformers who wanted them created, um, again, late 19th century, turn of the 20th, recognized that there is a huge range with kids that age in what's normal, what's developmentally normal in every aspect of development, sort of physical, the stuff we see, social, emotional, intellectual, and that sometimes there are kids of that age who may lag behind academically. It doesn't mean they're less intelligent. It doesn't mean that they're fated to be less successful further on, or even to be, unsuccessful academically further on, unless their sense of themselves is kind of wrecked and they don't get a good foundation. But even so, that the schools for them had to take that enormous variability into account, and that there ought to be as much individualized education as possible as a result. And that is just something that certainly never came into being in the schools. Every set of reformers that would come in and try to create something better would say the exact same thing, and it pretty much wouldn't happen. And it's also a message that somehow never made it to parents, and I think especially today, we're so normative and we worry so much about how our kids are measuring up and if they're where they're supposed to be, and we're so judgmental in our use of words like mature or immature that we really join with the kids in that at that point when they're worrying so much about how they stack up and, if they're looking the way they're supposed to look. So I just wish that that particular message had gotten through at some point or would get through now.
Yeah, I was really struck by your discussion in the book of variability and the importance of understanding that in middle school. It reminded me a little bit of, I remember watching kids learn to read when they're younger,
Exactly.
that there had to be actually like a brain development thing that happened before they could do it. And for some little children, having nothing to do with them being smarter or, it didn't reflect on their intellectual capability, but necessarily, but some kids that development happened earlier and some it happened later. And I remembered reading that in Finland, they didn't allow children to learn to read. They were forbidden to learn to read until they were 7, because then all their brains would be ready to really pick it up quickly. And I found that a great comfort when my own child was learning to read and when she was younger.
And that's a decision that really reflects the values of a culture, right? I mean, they wait until everybody is ready. They're not looking to speed it up and try to sort of force everyone onto a path that, has somehow been decided as will be the road to Harvard, as
Right.
tend to behave here. And I think that, that kind of attitude writ large would be enormously helpful for middle schoolers and also for their parents.
Well, it also, the other thing I was thinking about when I was reading your book was a concept that I got from my work that I've done on breast cancer, which is the idea of misfearing. And misfearing is the idea that we tend to focus on, we're afraid of the wrong thing. And
Right.
We focus on the wrong thing and not on the thing that we actually should be worried about. And it struck me there was a lot of misfearing by parents going on in middle school. I wondered if you thought that was true. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that that's where the myths come in. The fears, again, especially, it's a little bit less now than there was in the period of absolute hysteria of the 1990s, the late 90s and the early 2000s. There's this fear that they're getting up to all sorts of new and terrible things, new states of degradation, far worse than anything ever encountered, by any 12, 13-year-old in the past. And it's all playing out in ways that we can't even imagine, right? So, there's this need for incredible hypervigilance because it's so bad and they're so bad and worse than ever. None of that is backed up by fact. There is absolutely no statistical evidence for any of that. And in fact, what evidence there is shows that kids today are essentially behaving in a, quote unquote, younger way, let's say, than they did a generation ago. They're getting less into sex, drugs, smoking, drinking, all of that kind of thing. They're better than we were, let's say. Mm-hmm. They're getting up to less. And parents
have less freedom
in believing it. Well, they don't have as much freedom. Ironically, the fact that they're spending so much more time online means that they're getting up to less stuff together. Mm-hmm. But even the online stuff, which is really so feared, I think, by every single parent, pretty much at every age, but especially, I think, at that age, there's so much, there are a lot of studies now showing that, social media is essentially a tool, and it's a tool that should and can be essentially neutral. Depends what use it's put to. Unfortunately, middle schoolers put it to the same use as we used to put landlines and, analog forms of communication like really mean notes or slam books, and unfortunately it travels with you and it's ubiquitous and it's there 24/7. But essentially they're doing the exact same things that we did. They just do them a little bit different. They just
it's the amplification and the impact online. And I, that is something that I don't know if you felt your kids are older than mine, or if you have a feeling from your research, but it seemed to me that social media was the worst possible concept or the worst possible tool for kids that age, that putting that into their hands was a recipe for exactly that kind of behavior, that it was just developmentally, they were going to turn it into a slam book, and that was going to be really hard.
That's true. But then at the same time, sometimes it can give them a way to keep in touch with, let's say, camp friends. I mean, there are a lot of
Mhm.
kids that are who are miserable in school and in heaven when they go to camp in the summer.
Mhm.
And this, social media does give them a way to be much more in contact with those friends than they would have been before, or even in going through what we're living through right now. They do
Mhm.
have a way to stay in touch. I mean, they need to be in touch with other people their age, and they have
Yeah.
a way to do it. I'm also hearing that a lot of kids that age are now connecting to, let's say, old elementary school friends who they had to drop because, they weren't like on brand once they hit sixth
Mhm.
or seventh grade, if they moved up in the social hierarchy. Well, with no one watching, they can reconnect to these other friends who sort of in the
Mm.
normal course of the school day, they were snubbing. So I really think that a lot of what plays out in social media, just as has always been the case for middle schoolers and junior high schoolers, has to do with the values of the communities that they're in, the school communities, the parent communities, and that there are ways that adults can at least try to set norms about how we think about and deal with other human beings that can at
Mhm.
least play a role. And I also think that kids, we worry so much about, where they are in math, but schools could be providing social media literacy early
Mhm.
on so that kids thought more critically about things like what a curated life is and how
Right.
people create it, an appearance versus reality.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think that you're right, that all those images, body image for girls, self-sexualization, all these things start coming into play in ways that they did when we were young. And you talk about, Brooke Shields and seeing some of the things that you did when you were young, but that they happened, you know, off camera in the
Right.
past, and now they happen on camera, and that just seems so much bigger and more public and more permanent and a harder way to have to go through that learning.
I think that's true. And the things, because so much of online commenting is anonymous, people can say absolutely horrific things. But
Yeah.
I do tend to think that if we can start to educate these kids in sort of what is sheerly idiotic, like putting, nude pictures of yourself online, or even putting pictures online that are destined to bring on the worst sort of comments, right?
Hmm.
That at least be smart about what you're going into. Like, know that this is
Hmm.
definitely what's going to happen. And do you actually want to undergo that? So that they're
Right.
not, caught by surprise each time. Um,
Right.
and also, I think, I mean, and you've written about this so much. We've sort of turned in a direction, girls and sex wise, overall, that's incredibly unhelpful for anything that has to
Yeah.
do with body image or integrity or, maintaining self.
Pleasure.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I, way before that work that I did, my first book was about middle schoolers.
Yeah.
And and I have to say, I mean, I, I feel like we have such low expectations of them. I mean, I can remember when I was a middle schooler being at a family gathering with a distant cousin who was a middle school teacher, had junior high then teacher, and she said, "Oh, we should just lock them up in some building for 3 years and let them battle it out, and then let them come out when they're in." And I was that age, and I thought, "Hey," but I loved working with kids that age. I thought they were thoughtful, they were delightful, they were open, they were engaged, they were interested, they were self-reflective. I just feel like we kind of underestimate them to a great degree.
I think that's true. And I also think that disdain, dislike, all of that becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. If kids are being told nonstop how awful they are, right? And that
Yeah.
their group identity is to be absolutely horrible, I mean, they will rise or sink to meet expectations. And the kind of reaction that you got from that junior high teacher makes me think that probably this wasn't somebody whose first choice it was to teach
Right.
that age group. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of educators who stick with this age group because they find that they absolutely love working with them. And for all the reasons you just said, because it's a moment where they are so awake and alive and eager to learn more about the world and to think critically, and they have a strong sense of social justice, all these things that,
Yeah.
if you're only remembering the bad parts of your own middle school experience, which is what we tend to do, or if you have a kid who just went through something horrific, I think it's probably, it sounds super Pollyanna-ish to say all of that. But, people who work with these kids a lot and have done so for a long time just swear by it. And it's so frustrating for them to have to hear how negatively they're viewed and have been viewed.
Well, yeah, and I look back at, my 13-year-old self hearing that and think, I haven't forgotten it. I mean, it's been a minute since I was 13, and I have not forgotten that moment. So it's,
Right.
I think those things really do stick. I wonder that you've talked a little bit about history, and you kind of alluded a little bit to culture or geography. Whether there's expectations or universals, or the kinds of things you're talking to, how they're mediated by geography, by race, by class, by the era that we live in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions that really most interested me as I did the research, whether, reading or talking to people. What's universal and what is socially constructed? And, we know that there are universals to the experience. I mean, going through puberty, right? And of course, going through puberty in a society which defines you in a certain way when you're going through the phase. And it's that, that definition by adults, the way adults look at the kids, which I think is the most important factor then shaping what the whole experience is and becomes, in terms of how kids feel about themselves becoming sexual people, whether that is a huge source of discomfort or not a huge source of discomfort. I mean, in the US, it does vary by race. I mean, just in the degree to which adults sexualize you, Black children are sexualized more and younger and are considered by adults to be more, threatening and more oppositional, for example, much, much younger, and start really bearing that weight of negative adult preconception and expectation at that age.
You're talking about adults outside of the family?
Yes,
Primarily?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Adults in school, especially, but sort of particularly white adults kind of out in the community at large start kind of bringing this negative force to bear, which then can play out in incredibly destructive ways in school, and in all the ways that we've been talking about lately, in trying to defund the police officers who are in school, for example, et cetera, to address some of that. And one thing that I really did wonder about early on is the way that we talk about middle school, like what you and I have been talking about, is it a white narrative? Is it a white middle class narrative? There's a degree to which, yeah, it definitely is. There's a degree to which a lot of the stuff we associate with this is like kind of a middle and upper middle class thing, because so much of the kind of hyper parenting that I write about that surrounds it depends on people having enough money and time to be able to do that stuff and go so crazy. And there's also research showing now that meanness increases along with the competitiveness in well-off communities, that both parents and kids behave worse in communities that feel entitled, that have a tendency to regard other people as sort of lesser, or as servants, as a principal in a public school in New Jersey who had actually been in, schools ranging from the South Bronx in the 80s to well-off suburbs, more recently, and then back to working class communities. And he said he really sees it, It's also interesting and completely counterintuitive that research is showing now that when it comes to drug use, depression, anxiety, aggression toward one another, kids in upper middle class communities are again doing worse than our middle class kids or low income kids. And the theory there is because they're under so much pressure, and being under that kind of pressure, being engaged in a competitive way of life all the time just doesn't lead to either happiness or to being nice to others.
But you were also, while you were researching this book, you were writing a report on how bias, trauma, and family hardship affect girls and women, right?
Right.
And I wondered if that dovetailed with your work in middle school, and if so, how, and how unequal outcomes were forged in middle school, or if they're forged in middle school. Obviously, they're forged much earlier and in many other ways.
Right. I mean, for that report, which was for the Center for American Progress, I was looking at the issue of adultification, which I, referred to
Mhm.
before in talking about Black middle schoolers. And their researchers at Georgetown had done a study finding that the way in which adults, quote unquote, adultified girls was the greatest, the difference in how white girls and Black girls were viewed in terms of sort of how mature they were, how much sexual knowledge they had, how, basically just sort of how good and pure they were. Basically, I mean, nobody uses that kind of terminology anymore. That you had a really wide gap, particularly between the ages of 10 and 14, with obviously with Black girls being judged more negatively and harshly. I was also looking at mental health outcomes, and you see an uptick in depression and anxiety in all kids at that age, and especially in girls. And there's been a real problem of an uptick in suicide in Latino communities among girls in that age group now too. So there are all of these pressures that come to bear on everyone, that are happening at a moment of universal growth and developmental change that's both physical and psychological, emotional and cognitive. And then it plays out in a society where these kids are viewed with more or less respect according to their race and their socioeconomic status.
Interesting. One thing that I also thought a lot about reading your book is how, for some cultures, this is a time when kids go through a ritual, right? Where they go through a kind of coming of age transition ritual. And I remember when we were doing my daughter's bat mitzvah, my feeling about B'nai Mitzvah was that it was like the worst possible time to force a child to get up on essentially a stage in front of the world and have to sing in a foreign language. Like, what could be worse? But actually going through it, I ended up feeling like it's sort of like that seen and supported idea, that it was the most wonderful time to do that, to have a whole community say, yes, you are up there with your acne and your cracking voice and your awkwardness and your everything, and we love you and we see you and we're going to support you in moving through this into another phase. And I wondered, it just seemed like, oh, I kind of understood why we have rituals for children that age, and feel that there should be more, maybe.
I think it's a good thing when there are rituals for children that age, like 8th grade graduation. There were a lot of parents who were feeling very guilty this year about the fact that they were sad that there wasn't going to be an 8th grade graduation, given everything else going on. It ranks pretty low in the hierarchy of tragedy, but still, that is a real phase of transition that's worth marking for kids, but even more, I think, actually, for the parents. Because things are about to change really dramatically, especially for them. There's a lot of loss that goes along with it. It gets packaged as, I guess it's sort of the equivalent of misfearing. It's sort of misfeeling, You hear about the anger and, oh, they're impossible, and, how horrible they are. You don't hear about how the parents are suffering the loss of their sort of cuddly children who drew pictures for them all the time and loved them so much and wanted to be with them all the time. But I really do think that feeling of loss, which we don't name, which I certainly would not have named at the time, I think that it plays a very big role with us now, especially in this generation, because we are so sort of in it, with our kids. And we are in so many ways kind of emotionally sustained by them, that we have to experience the withdrawal of that sustenance right at that point. And it's really tough. And I think it wouldn't be a bad thing for adults to be able to more consciously commemorate that, along with whatever rituals are happening that are actually, aimed at the kids. I just wish
love that.
stopped doing those sweatshirts with bar and bat mitzvahs, or
Right.
invite the whole class. Don't invite, the cool kids and then have the sweatshirts just for them. I mean,
Oh, I don't, that's not my world.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so how do we, as we, I want to get to questions people have, but how do we equip our middle schoolers? You know, if we're, as parents, we're misfearing, we're catastrophizing, we are overly competitive, we are instilling the sense that there's this very narrow idea of success that's creating a kind of competitive environment and meanness in a lot of children. How do we equip them better to be resilient and embody the values that we say we want them to have moving forward, and the things that will really help sustain them as they move into a new phase of life?
I guess the question is,
In 2 minutes or less,
yeah, I
please.
guess the
Yeah.
question is, do we really have those values? So, do we want them to really have those values and fully inhabit those values? Or do we want them to be successful and happy? I'm not saying those things have to be mutually exclusive. It's just the question is what's really motivating people. And I think, everyone wants their kids to be happy, absolutely. But very often they want them to be, if they're being happy is at the expense of someone else, that's okay because it's necessary and that's what it is to be a good parent, right? But in fact, it's not. And those are opportunities where parents are sort of falling down on the job in sort of more consciously thinking about what's motivating them and what would really lead to happiness. So, I mean, I think a great deal more critical thinking about what we as adults are doing, parents or schools, and what kind of culture we're creating for our kids is the first place to start in trying to make things better.
Anything on pandemic parenting that you got in your back pocket for me?
As you said, my kids are a little older, and what I have found is great for us is that we give each other as much space as possible. We're in a very small house, but I've found that we're giving each other more space, but in a positive way. I don't mean we're not talking than before, that people kind of have their own world in their heads that is being respected, let's say, and that people aren't constantly barging into. And I think of that now, the relevance of that is just, I've been talking to people a lot about what to do with middle schoolers, social media, should you be spying on them or not spying on them? And my gut has always been that you should not be. And I've heard that now backed up by a number of experts who agree. And I really do think that, I mean, this is such a huge topic and we're not going to, lose a ton of time on it, but at that age, they have the right to an inner life. And they're developing a very rich inner life, but they're also experimenting a great deal with what that inner life contains, including what kinds of words, what kinds of images. And I think they need the space to be able to sometimes be obnoxious, to do their like kids stuff without adults realizing it and gasping and being horrified, because it probably means a whole lot less than adults think, that it actually means.
I have a million more things I could ask you, but I want to give the invisible 99 participants a little bit of a chance here. So let's start with a question from James, who says, Judith, how have the reactions to your book changed your point of view? Is there something you would have covered differently or paid more or less attention to? From James Gibney.
What Peggy said about bar and bat mitzvahs, for example, I really didn't write about these, ceremonies marking transitions, and the not talking about bar and bat mitzvahs is actually kind of a glaring absence, because I would look at it in terms of sort of, the transitional ceremonies around the world and traditional cultures, and not look at what was sort of right in front of us so frequently. So I do think it would have been nice to have a little bit more of that in there. And I could do I could now like re-edit the entire book and make everyone crazy.
Always.
That's the main thing I would do differently. I did a lot of sort of, perfectionistic obsessive rewriting during the course of writing it. And so I'm actually pretty satisfied with what's in it in the end, which is nice.
That reminds me of a book that I'm pretty sure that we read when we listened to an audiobook when I think my daughter was in middle school by then, called Nation by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett, was such a wonderful writer in so many ways. But Nation was interesting because it pivoted on this thing that all kids did at that transitional age, and then like somehow while the kid was off doing it, everybody died or something, so he had to go and start the nation over again. But it was a great book to read if you don't have a ritual in your culture for your
Yeah.
middle schooler, to sort of create thoughts about one in their head and what that might
Right.
look like. It was really I really recommend it.
My big book middle school memory is the Lovely Bones, which tells you something about the mother
You weren't
daughter in
in
our
middle
home. No, my
oh,
daughter
your
read
daughter
it.
was in middle school. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That and The Giver.
It's
Yeah, The
so
Giver
dark.
was always really big.
Um,
Phyllis Lerner says, as long as you're talking about variability and we're on an edge of getting at systemic racial inequities, what are some of the gender and racial patterns you see across our varied, well, you've talked about this a little bit. I don't know if you have anything more to say. Gender and racial patterns across culture.
I mean, I talk about a lot of it more in the book,
Yeah.
but it kind of more down in the weeds than maybe we have time for now, or that, I mean, if there was something, if you have like a really specific follow-up to ask me, then I could address that.
Yeah. Here's a question. Could it be that middle schoolers are amazing, but not necessarily with their parents? Can I just say yes? Before I answer this question, I would just like to insert that I feel to a great degree that age and the subsequent age as well, there's that aspect of the way that kids were in preschool, where they would be such model little citizens holding it together all day, and then they would come home and just lose it because they were safe, because that was their space. And I think that middle schoolers, it's like a rerun of 2, 3, 4, 5, at 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah. Anyway, it seems that part of this developmental process is a separation from parents and a rejection. And this is what makes it such a fraught period. I know that as a middle school mother, I've never felt so ineffective and sad as a parent in there. Can you speak to what parents are experiencing at this phase of life?
Yeah, and I want to circle back for 1 second to the question about race and class, which is, a lot of the stories in the book, the ones that I selected to tell at length, dive into that so that you hear it in, as an anecdote, as a lived experience, which gets at the larger themes. And I think that's really, really important, because often, there are these layers of experience of what we're all used to, what we all experience, what we expect, coming into something, a certain age where we're supposed to be. But then you have these layers of race and class added to that, which kind of change the whole thing and complicates it further and makes people situate themselves differently in relation to the sort of bigger cultural expectations. And I mean, I think it's really, really fascinating. In terms of the difficulties of this age for being a parent, right? For why it's such a hard time for parents. I mean, that was the question, right? The second or recent question. For so many
and
of
that
the
feeling
reasons,
of inefficacy and sadness,
yes.
which I think a lot of people can relate to, that you feel like you've been like, you knew how to parent, you were like, you had this, you got this, and then suddenly it's like, oh my God, I suck, I don't know what to do, I'm terrible, right. I'm ineffective. I think that's a really common feeling that we don't talk about that much as parents of kids that age.
And yet there's science to back it up. I mean, there are studies that show, one that was relatively recent and then some that go back a couple of decades, that the start of puberty marks this moment where parents' feelings of self-efficacy just plummet. And, and it's exactly that. They felt like they had kind of figured out what they were doing, and then they just feel useless. Now, maybe sometimes it's because their kids are telling them specifically that they're useless. It's also, I think, that kids' needs become so much more complex. And also the problems that they encounter aren't things that are going on at home. It's really what's going on out in the world socially for them, by and large, that causes them the most distress. I also think that they're getting to a phase of life where we ourselves have so much unresolved stuff. We went through so much that lives on in us very powerfully, and that very often we still don't know what it means. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people who have stories where, like, they go to school and everyone stopped talking to them. They don't know why. And to this day, they don't know why. you know, or all of a sudden people were telling them, you know, they were annoying and they don't know why, but they still feel it deep down. And so when similar things happen to our kids, I think that we're really at a loss in knowing how to help, because we never figured it out ourselves. And I think that's something that I know that I personally picked up a lot of tools from doing this research for thinking about social interactions, whether it's kids that age or social interactions in general, because a lot of the traits that we have that lead to the kinds of experiences we have at those ages are still with us today. And it's sort of a question of like, the skills we didn't get then, we can still get, and we can bring added knowledge and better tools to helping our kids out.
And I think there's a lot more of that for parents in when you start reading the book that you can draw from, which I think will help with the person who's asking a very similar question, the next one, which is, I have a 12-year-old boy. The elementary school years were so easy. I feel like I don't know how to parent anymore. Any suggestions? I think you're speaking to that, and I think, you know, again, I want to say that that is a normative feeling for parents of kids this age. And so I also think that there has to be a certain compassion that we have for ourselves around that, not to sound too much like I do live in California, but I do. I think we have to recognize that it's as you said earlier, it's a time of loss, it's a time of change, and it's a time and transition and difficulty in trying to figure out what our relationship is vis-a-vis our kids. And there can be a lot of sort of you know, blockages followed by growth spurts, you know, that and hard times followed by something that suddenly reveals itself. So to have a little patience and compassion for yourself, I think, is important too.
And I think there too, our culture really, the parenting culture, you know, that we've had for the past couple of decades really doesn't help us out. I mean, if you go back a little bit further, there really was an emphasis on kids becoming more independent, differentiating, you know, that parents sort of being in their space and kids being in their space, and growth and change, you know, these were good things. And now there's so much emphasis on really kind of being tightly there with your kids, which is a perfectly fine thing. But then you knock up against a developmental moment where what they really need to do is not be so tightly in there with you. And yet it's very easy then, if they're like shutting their door, not talking to us, it's very easy to feel like you're failing, that you've done something wrong, rather than they're doing what they need to be doing and it's fine. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad is going on or that they're depressed. And, you know, it's a question of finding a way to shift your roles so that you can be asking kind of light rather than probing questions, let's say, you know, about what's going on in a kid's life. And also being able to take a step back and really, I don't think as an adult, as opposed to thinking like a middle schooler, so that when painful things happen or maddening things happen, you don't have to go down into that kind of cauldron of emotion with them. You know, you can sit back and try to give them some rational tools for thinking critically, maybe trying to see things from other people's perspectives. But I think overall, it's just so important to be able to take a lighter touch at that point, rather than having to be so tightly in there.
Somebody is asking here, I don't know if you have an answer to this, but if you know anything about unique challenges, you can speak to any unique challenges middle schoolers face in parochial school.
That is a really good question. And no, I don't. I really don't. I think sometimes schools that are more structured and traditional and single sex, sometimes, but can be really helpful in setting, just in setting sort of some norms around, you know, how people should be treated, how we treat one another. I think uniforms can be helpful up to a point. I mean, you know, in flattening down hierarchies. I think also sometimes in very hierarchical traditional schools where the adults maybe aren't so touchy-feely with the kids.
Oop. I don't know if Judith just froze or I just froze.
I think she froze. Let's see if she can come back.
Oh no, right in a crucial point. And I'm loving, I will say, I'm eating ahead on these questions and I really want to get them in, but we're running out of time because they are so wonderful. And I think Judith really, some of them she addresses, I think you'll find a lot of grist for your parenting mill in the book itself, and some of these issues on gender and some of the issues on exclusion. Yeah, I think she's gone though.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well,
It's just the 89 of us now. Yes, well, I guess that is an ignominious way to end, but we were about to, I don't know what to do. What do I do, Mr. Politics and
I'm
Prose?
not, I'm not sure. I guess I'll say one more time. You guys should all purchase the book. I think we all learned a lot tonight. And I'm gonna put a link right here in the chat. Yeah,
I think
I
we'll
don't
just
know.
have to say goodbye to Judith.
Yeah. Oh,
Oh,
wait.
wait, she's back. She's back. You're back. Yourself, Judy. Judy, you're muted.
Sorry. On my end, I couldn't even tell that there was anything wrong. It wasn't frozen on my end, but
Oh,
sorry. I don't know what
that's
happened.
okay. Well, if it's okay with you to just go a little bit longer because because we just had to cut off. We were about to say goodbye to you, but you're back. There was a question here on whether you thought that boys had it easier than girls or whether they just hide their struggles better.
I think in some ways both. I mean, I think that the struggles kick in more for boys a little bit older. I mean, boys go through puberty about a year and a half, 2 years after girls do. And so a lot of the angsty stuff or the physical changes, the stuff that's just hard, I think, in going from being a child to a teenager, it happens a little later. And so some have a very similar experience to the girls in middle school. Not all, though. Some are really kind of at the younger end and they don't experience the unhappiness of it as much. But some do. And I mean, bullying, I don't write very much about bullying in the book because there are other books that are specifically just on bullying and are very, very good. And because bullying is not the most typical form that middle school meanness takes. It's sort of the extreme form, which I'm not saying it never happens. Obviously, it happens a lot and way too much. But fortunately, it's not the most common form of it. But, boys definitely get bullied. It's consistently the smaller boys, the ones who are at the kind of younger end, the more bookish ones, the ones who are not athletic, they're the ones who end up, even if not being bullied, just kind of being pushed to the sideline. So I think it's a very complicated time. It can be a really hard time for boys too.
And there are several questions here. I know your book isn't specifically on bullying, but there are questions about issues around exclusion in girl culture, people who are saying that during COVID, friends stopped talking, everybody stopped talking to them, or that dealing with mean girl culture, that kind of thing in middle school. If you have any thoughts about that? And then I have one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
It's interesting because during this COVID period, I've also heard that some parents saying that it was kind of a blessing for their kids because they were not having to deal with as much of the exclusion as before, just the kind of common day-to-day nonstop stuff of where you sit in the cafeteria, whether a seat is held for you or not held for you, or whether there's room, in the classroom, do you get to sit with somebody, the one person who's by, him herself, who doesn't have a work partner, that kind of thing. At least those parts of things, which frankly could be addressed by schools. They're pretty simple structural ways those kinds of situations could simply be avoided in the first place. But at least kids aren't experiencing them now to the same extent, certainly, and not those specific things. I've even spoken to one researcher who has found that kids' mental health improved over the course of this period. And she believes that it's because they're out of the usual social fray and they're just not having to deal with as much exclusion as they would be normally. So, while social media is, I know, undoubtedly is being used to, exclude some now, some are getting a reprieve, a decent number is getting a reprieve.
Interesting. Okay, so last question that I'll ask is somebody who is a high school teacher wanted to know what, if anything, you learned from educators of middle school students.
Was really
Did you?
the positive. Am I frozen? Or am
you unfroze. Yeah.
Okay. It was the positive stuff. It was the extent to which a lot of them and delight them. And that was really important to learn. It was also very helpful to know that there is a lot classroom to try to minimize the impact of the clickiness and the popularity stuff and the hierarchy stuff that kids that age just, naturally. And it was great to have concrete examples of things that, schools can do overall or that can happen in individual classrooms to make things better without singling kids out, as being either the ones who are left out or the ones who are, perceived as the mean kids.
Great. Well, I like ending there. That's a nice positive note. And thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing the book. And I hope that you will all go into the chat, click the link, help out Politics and Prose, get a great read, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Well, thank you, Peggy, for your great questions, for writing the book way back in the 90s that basically established this whole genre.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, you did. And thank you to everybody who tuned in tonight. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you so much to you both, Judith and Peggy. This was a really fascinating discussion, and I think we all have a lot to think about. And just to reiterate one more time, there's a link in the chat to buy the book, and we hope you all do that. And we'll see you next time on Politics and Prose Live. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.